Welcome back to Build Back Better. I'm Tabitha Goldstorp, co-founder of CogX, and it's a delight to be welcoming you from wherever you are in the world today. We all know and heard again this morning about the serious diversity and inclusion issues in the tech industry. Fewer than 1% of Black startup founders are receiving venture funding, and all of our panelists have made clear time and time again that this needs to change in order for the entire ecosystem to properly thrive. But how? Well, I'm thrilled to welcome Sarah Kunst, the managing director of Cleo Capital. She'll be talking to Deborah O'Connell, founder and CEO of YSYS, about the importance of investing in diversity and how to change the ratio. Don't forget to send your questions to Sarah on the CogX platform, and of course, make connections and continue the conversation with each other using the networking features. But now it's time to turn to Sarah and Deborah. Are you here?
Hi.
Hello.
Thank you both so much. Have a great conversation. I'll see you at the end.
Thank you.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to be here and to have Sarah Kunst sharing her amazing work and her amazing experience, really forwarding and investing in diverse founders and more. So for those that don't know, Sarah Kunst is the managing director of Cleo Capital. She's also a contributing editor of Mary Claire, and she's also an advisor for Bumble's fund. Sarah, it is awesome to have you here.
Thank you. It's awesome to be here.
So I'm going to jump straight into it. You've managed to raise a £3.5 million fund, which is awesome. You've also been named, I think, by the Wall Street Journal as one of the top 20 women in VC. I don't know how you're doing it. That's amazing. But with your fund, you're running currently 2 amazing programs around encouraging individuals to become scouts, as well as encouraging and supporting individuals to get back into the workforce. Can you share a little bit about those programs and the difference between the two, and as well as your aims?
Absolutely. So, our Scout program, and a Scout program kind of just broadly means that I'm giving people the ability to angel invest who don't have the personal capital. They're able, a very select group of founders who all happen to be women, work with my fund, and they are able to angel invest out of my fund. And so that's Scout investing. It's relatively common in Silicon Valley in the US, and I think it's starting to come to other cities and other parts of the world as well. And so we're super excited about that program. And then we also this year did another program called Chrysalis. And Chrysalis was an awesome program that we did once COVID started. And all of a sudden, within a month, there were massive layoffs in the US. We haven't done a great job as a country on sort of stimulus packages, making sure that people can keep their employees employed. And so there was a ton of layoffs. And I'd been in a similar situation in 2008 during that recession, right after I graduated. And, that's how I ended up in tech. And so I knew that good things could come of this sort of crazy moment. And, a lot of big VCs were saying, it's time to build. Like statistically, it's shown that this is, downturns are a great time to start a company. But then you're like, okay, how do I build? And they're like, I don't know, right? And so I was like, well, I do know. And I started Chrysalis, which was a program that we had hundreds of applicants. We had over 100 people in the program. And it basically was bringing together people who had recently been laid off, putting them in a Slack group, teaching them, they're all, incredibly brilliant people, but teaching them that kind of 0 to 1 of how do you think about getting a startup idea, incorporating, like getting your, initial pitch deck together, your initial product together, your MVP, how do you start to talk to users, all of those things. And so, it was really, really cool to be able to have that experience. And we've seen some great stuff come out of it. We've seen over 20 projects that got started and over 10 companies that are up and running today from people who had no idea even March 1st that this is what they'd be doing this year.
That's fantastic. And that's 20 products. That's awesome in such a short period of time. And I think that sometimes that's the beauty of, I guess, having diversity at its core. And so I'd love to learn a little bit more about if you have a thesis for the angels that you work with, or is there a thesis also with the fellows that come into the program, like this is a mission or this is what we want you to work on and so forth?
So I don't like people telling me what to do. And I think most smart people don't love to be told what to do. And so I'm much less interested in telling my scouts or the fellows in Chrysalis or anybody I work with, hey, here's what you have to do, right? Here is like, I am telling you, you could only build this kind of company or invest in this kind of company. I'm interested in taking, awesome, diverse, to your point, brilliant people, and putting them, in an environment where they can thrive and seeing what they come up with. So I guess if there's a thesis, that's it.
Awesome. And what would you say, I guess, the risks are, right? So if you are, searching within your own kind of networks, what would you say the risks are in doing so? And how do we move beyond
yeah, I think, that's an interesting question, because people kind of ask that question a lot. And it's sort of funny, right? Because that's like saying, if somebody says to you, oh, I only really, I don't leave my town very much. I only really go out to eat in my town. Their dining options, if they're in a town of 200 people with one pub, or if they're in London, are slightly different, right? And so anybody that you're working with is in your network, right? Like, Deborah, you and I just met, but you're now in my network, right? So you're literally across the ocean and, haven't met you in person, but you're in my network now. And so it's not that you should go outside of your network, because what that would mean, practically speaking, in the investing world, is that you're just driving past people on the street and like throwing millions of dollars at them, which seems kind of irresponsible, right? But the problem is that most people's networks are incredibly small and incredibly homogenous, right? So they don't have people from other countries, races, schools, genders, whatever it is. And that's not just me saying, oh, white dudes only talk to white dudes. That's me saying that, my network, Deborah, doesn't just look like us, right? It's not just Black women. And that, we know that diversity drives returns. And the reality is, diversity doesn't mean a group of Black women or a group of, Asian men or a group of whatever. It means that, you kind of look like a United Colors of Benetton ad, right? And you're bringing together a bunch of different people. And so, I do only invest in my network, but the difference is that my network spans the entire world, and, all genders, all races, all abilities, and that makes a huge difference.
Awesome. And I think having that intersectional approach to things, I think that's how we're going to ensure that everyone's included in the conversation. Like I always say, like, rather than having a Noah's Ark approach, like Black people first, women next, LGBTQ plus community, if we focus on intersectionality, then we can ensure that all individuals are have the opportunity of equality and equity and more. So I think that's super powerful.
Yeah.
Like with your fellowship program, I think that's amazing work, especially during such uncertain times when it comes to job stability, talent mobility, and more. And I'll be curious to understand a little bit in terms of maybe challenges that either yourself or what you see in your fellows and startups face during the pandemic, and what the positives have been from that.
Yeah, look, it is, if you have positives during COVID, right, you're in an incredibly privileged position, which, like, duh, and get to speak to all of you amazing people. Like, of course, I'm in an incredibly privileged position. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that, right? But that being said, this is, I think, in a given week before COVID, if I'd gotten an invite to come speak here at CogX, I would have been super excited. And then it might have taken a year or more, because it would have been, okay, when do the dates align where I'm in the UK and where this can work, right? And then it would have been, oh, I think I'm going to go there. Oh, but this conference got moved. Oh, but this, I missed my flight. I did this. It's so hard, right? Now I can be here, and like the only inconvenience is that, I got up at like 6 a.m. to be ready for it, right? Versus I got up at 6 a.m. to go to the airport, wait for 2 hours, take a 7-hour flight, go through, you know what I mean? So the sort of flattening of that world that's happening, I think, is really, really cool. And something that, while it's amazing to have in-person events, I do hope some of this stays, because I think that it's awesome to be able to get a more broad perspective. And for me, it's awesome to be able to meet people from all over the world.
Fantastic. Yeah, I love the digital world that I guess the pandemic has sort of brought. I think it allows, we're seeing that in movements as well. Like when it comes to hashtag Black Lives Matter, when it comes to NSARS with the police brutality that's happening in Nigeria, individuals able to mobilize a lot more faster because we can use things like WhatsApp, we can jump on a Zoom, we can send video recordings. And so this kind of digital mobilization is really allowing individuals to connect and share messages and much more. So absolutely agree. You're doing a lot more. You're doing incredible loads of great stuff. And I'm just curious to learn more about I guess your experience with the Bumble Fund. Again, I think that's an awesome initiative. And what we're seeing is that founders are just not only just focusing on building products for their users, but they also want to contribute to society and contribute to building the next entrepreneurs. And through the Bumble Fund, that's what's happening. And I'd love to learn more about your experience and I guess the value that you're adding there and the vision you hope to see with it.
Yeah, and just to clarify, so I was an advisor at Bumble, a senior advisor, and helped them launch Bumble Fund, which when I was there, we were only able to invest in US-based startups. And so unfortunately, I'm not totally sure if they do international now, although they do a lot of awesome stuff in the UK. And right now they've been doing a big effort around Black History Month there. And My Love is Black Love campaign that's been really, really fun to watch. But, with Bumble Fund, and this started a couple of years ago, the idea was really simple, which was, hey, we know women get less funding. We know women of color get even more less funding. And, we're a big company and we've had some success and we have some money to help change that. And so it's just been a really amazing process to be a part of. And now it's been really interesting a couple of years later, with everything that's gone on, at least in the US this year around, protests, around, racism, and to see a lot of other companies sort of raise their hand and say, wait, we should also probably be a part of that, has been really, really cool. And so, my takeaway and my real inspiration from that was, I think when we started Bumble Fund, Bumble was only like a 3-year-old company, right? So sometimes founders think that they have to wait years and years and years before they can do something cool. And in reality, you don't. You can have a massive impact pretty early in the life of your company. And so don't ever feel like, that giving back is something that you wait until, you're a billionaire or, you're retired, right? It's something that I think all of us can do right now, even when we're at companies or building companies.
100%. It's never too late to start paying it forward. And absolutely kudos. And I know around your investment thesis for Cleo Capital is around basic needs and really shining a light on those individuals that are working within the consumer sector. I'd love for you to share a little bit more about what does basic needs mean to Cleo Capital?
Yeah. So, for us, our investing is in 2 main buckets. So one of the buckets is complicated consumer. And that is really the insight that, when you think of consumer, right, stuff, you think of like, hey, I'm going to buy, new jewelry, new lipstick, whatever. The reality is, while sometimes it feels like life or death, it is very rarely life or death to buy new jewelry or new lipstick, right? But the things that are life or death that we have to deal with on our own, at least in America, there's not a lot of help for, right? So, you have to do your taxes, or, in the US, it's really common to graduate university with, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt. And, you have to save for your own retirement. You have to buy your own health insurance. Like it is really tough over here. Don't come. But, it's one of those things where there's no one to help you do any of those things. And, if you can't afford an expensive accountant or lawyer or whatever, you're sort of on your own, right? Even buying a house is really complicated and scary and confusing, or buying a huge purchase like a car, or, estate planning when someone passes away. So, what we do is we go look for companies that are solving those problems, right? So we're looking for companies that say, hey, this with the same ease that you use Instagram, you can manage your student loan debt, or you can, set up your will and trust for when you pass away. And those are the kinds of companies that we're really excited about, because they are making a huge difference in people's lives in a really, really real, fundamental way.
That's awesome. I think entrepreneurs have so much power and influence to really solve some of the most pressing challenges that our society faces. I was reading about some of the your startups that you invested in that are performing really well. I know one was founded by a woman, one's founded by a man of color. I guess, can you share with us some of the exciting portfolios that you're excited about?
Yeah. So, we have a lot of amazing companies, and in that kind of complicated consumer thesis, we have a lot of great stuff. We also have a lot of fun stuff in the other bucket we invest out of, which is the future of income. And the insight there is, at least in the US, the majority of income isn't made by kind of going, you go to your 9 to 5 job every day and you get a paycheck every 2 weeks. The majority of it comes from, anything from, money you get when you sell real estate to, if you're an Uber driver or Instacart shopper and you're getting, we call it 1099, but basically you're not a full-time employee, right? And in the US, that has massive impacts on your benefits, right? Your health insurance, your taxes, all of that. So, that's the other bucket we really invest in. In some companies that we're super excited about, we're in a company called Lunch Club, which is a really, really cool startup that is actually very popular in the UK as well. And it's perfect kind of complicated consumer, especially during COVID. You go on and you kind of put in your LinkedIn and you tell them a little bit about what you're looking for. If it's a new job, if you're looking for people to invest in you, you want to learn more about a new sector. And then every week it'll send you an email saying, what times work for you this week. And you select a couple times. And then they, magically using AI match you with somebody who is, looking to talk to somebody about similar things. And so, people meet investors on it, people meet people they start companies with, advisors, employees. It's just been really, really awesome to see that happen. And, before COVID, you were actually meeting in person. And now with COVID, it's all video, it's all digital. But the interesting thing is now you can meet with people anywhere. So I've had calls with people in London, with people in Spain, like all over the world, who have become friends with and have been able to do things with that I never, to go back to my comment about networks, right? Those are people who are now in my network who wouldn't have been if I said I only want to spend time with people who live, in my neighborhood in San Francisco.
Yeah, that's awesome. I still need to get on Lunch Club. I think there's so many apps. Lunch Club, House Party, Clubhouse. I think that's like 2020 apps of the century, which is awesome. I mean, if someone was to connect with you on Lunch Club and they wanted to pitch, what kind of advice would you give for individuals that are looking to pitch in this plan?
Yeah, I think in general with pitching, the most important thing is know what you're talking about and have like a really succinct elevator pitch, right? And I can't tell you how many times, even just emails, people email me and be like, "Hi, Sarah, like I was wondering if I could pitch you," and I'm like, they think I'm going to like respond to an email and then another email and like how many, like just send me that, like if I don't want to read it, I guess I'll delete it. Right. So I think that's a huge part of it is just being, really succinct and really powerful and knowing what you're talking about and having a, really clear kind of, here's exactly what I do. Right. So you mentioned House Party. So if you're the House Party founder, House Party is a fun group chat app, you would say, "Hey, Sarah, I'm Deborah. I'm the founder of House Party. And, House Party is a really great way to connect with, friends and do video chat, play games, interact on mobile. We've grown whatever 500x during COVID. We're raising around, whatever 5 million at a, 20 million valuation. See attached for deck. Would love to chat with you." I'm going to read that, right? And I'm either going to come back and tell you, I don't actually do consumer apps, but like, best of luck. That sounds amazing. I might know somebody who is interested, or I'm going to come back and say, great, let's have a meeting. But sending me an email or asking me, is it okay if I pitch you? That back and forth takes the same amount of time, but I don't know anything about your company. And then I'm also kind of like, oh God, if you can't effectively give me your elevator pitch, right, in 20 seconds, then I'm worried, like, how are you going to raise money from anybody?
Super powerful. And I think this was Monique who said this, that when it comes to diverse founders, they're often over-mentored, underfunded. And we're here I know that both of us on the call are super passionate about diverse founders having an equal level playing field. And so I guess what advice would you share for diverse founders when it comes to pitching? Is it the same? Is it the same way? Do they follow the same way that their white founders are doing?
Yeah, people always ask me that, and I always think it's kind of funny. Of course, it's the same, right? And meaning that, this is a bad example because it's super American, but in America, Black athletes weren't allowed to play professional sports until I think the 40s, and so when that started to happen, right? Jackie Robinson was pretty famously in America the first Black baseball player who was allowed to play, right? And so when he's allowed to play in the major leagues and in the white leagues instead of the Negro leagues, as they were called, he didn't, what advice would you have given him, right? Like, how many bases are there? There's, first, second, third, and then home. And, well, how do you hit a home run? Well, you hit it out pat, nothing's different. It's just that there was this artificial barrier, right? And it's the same with pitches. There's not oh, if you're a Black founder, TAM doesn't matter, or, CAC doesn't matter, or whatever, right? You still have to be building these huge businesses, which people are. The difference is, the receptivity to how do you get in front of people to pitch, right? How you might have to, because not everyone takes as expansive a view on networks as I do, you might need to spend more time up front thinking about how to build your network so that it is more diverse, right? Or, you might need to pitch, you probably do have to pitch more people and you'll raise less money. And that's because of racism. And I can solve a lot of things, now that I'm on my second coffee, but I can't solve that this morning. But, the reality is once you're going, you certainly, there's not anything different that you're doing. It's just that, it's probably going to be harder and take longer, right? And it's the same with women. It's the same with people of color. And that's not fair. But the idea that there would be a fundamentally different approach, right? When you're building the same companies, meaning you're building startups, you're building tech-enabled companies, you're building product, you need to incorporate, you need to get users and revenue and all those things. Of course that's the same, right? And so it's not that you need to do anything differently. It's that you need to kind of understand, which I think all of us understand. If you're in a marginalized group, you know it, right? Because people make sure to tell you how they feel about you. And so I don't think that this is something that is a shock, right? Mm-hmm. It's just understanding, hey, these are the barriers that exist, that by the way, exist in every category. This isn't just tech, right? People ask me sometimes, well, isn't venture capital, in tech bad for women of color in America? And I'm like, every industry is bad for women of color everywhere, as far as I can tell, right? Nurses and nurses and teachers, which historically, in the US are kind of viewed as female careers, get paid less than their male counterparts, right? So when you're a female nurse and you make less money than male nurses, even though nursing is considered a female profession, there isn't a great place to be a Black woman in America. I'm not sure there's a great place to be a Black woman in the world, right? And so my take on it is, at least in tech, you can become the next Mark Zuckerberg. And I just think that having money is a great way to sort of be able to make systemic change, because most systemic change is really expensive.
Yeah. I think Malcolm X said it really well when it comes to Black women in America, and I think that still stands true. And we need that protection and we need that support, but also wealth distribution will solve a lot of issues. And I think the more that we can put Black women, Black communities, underrepresented communities in position of wealth and power, that we will see the change that we want to see in the world. And so I completely agree with all those statements. And back on that, I guess, with everything that's happening in America, with Black Lives Matter, with the political unrest, has that changed, I guess, the way that you work, or have you seen founders change or respond differently based on the current climate?
It hasn't changed the way I work, because I was a Black woman before June, right? So for me, it hasn't changed. It hasn't changed a ton. What I do think, has changed is the conversation about it. Right now, I'll have conversations with, I'll literally, get calls and be on Zooms with middle-aged white men, and they'll be crying, and it's so wild. And I'm like, have you looked into a therapist? Because everybody should be in therapy. But it's this kind of dam has broken, and I think that, and we saw something similar, I think, during the Me Too stuff, where there were the people doing the bad things, and there were the people where the bad things would happen to them. And there was this gap in the middle of people who didn't have bad things happening to them and weren't doing bad things, who didn't understand how bad it was. And now they're all like, oh my gosh, like I'm hearing how bad it was, right? And this isn't okay. And what do I change? And, if you're somebody who's not overtly doing, bad things, but then you look around and realize that, by just sort of hiring the most qualified first person who showed up, right, and not running thorough hiring searches, your board is all white dudes, or your executive team, or your whatever, you don't have as much diversity as you should. And for you kind of thought, well, I'm sure I'll get it. And then you realize like how systemically the industry has made that almost impossible. Now you're probably going out and being a lot more thoughtful and mindful. And so I think the good part is that the people who mean well, but we're just kind of going with the flow, we're in a flow that, because of our industry, because of our world, is still deeply male, right? Even on the diversity side, even when you dig into the diversity stats of Black and Hispanic founders and VCs in America, the vast majority of those stats are about men, right? And so there is not a 50-50 split, right, of founders and VCs between men and women in the Black community in America. It is probably at least 75%. And when you look at where the money goes, probably 80 to 90% of it is going to men, right? So that's, I would say, much less of like a white dude problem, right? And that's much more of a problem of like, we need to look around at our own people and say like, hey, this table, if this is the Black people in tech group, like this needs to be half women, and those are things that we can do. But I think that awareness is the sort of first step to starting to change a problem, and the ability now to speak more freely about it, right? Whereas before, if you're at a majority white company and like you have like a weird interaction with somebody and it's like racist, but you feel like weird because you don't want to bring it up. I hope right now there's a understanding of, hey, my employer or my coworkers, they're okay. They want to hear about this stuff. They want to do something. They want to be helpful. So then you can talk about it more. And then by talking about it more, you can have more allies, right? Because when you think about sort of the term allies, which is a very popular term in the US, there's two parts of it. You have to, if you go back to World War II, right, if the Allied forces had said, hey, France, it looks like you're invaded, can we come do something? And France was like, no, we're totally fine. Don't worry about us. Then like, it's kind of like, what do? You're going to go like invade France when they tell you not to like get their invaders out? That's like odd, right? So I think that a part of having allies is understanding that we need to like help them, enable them to help us, right? Like, hey, here is my problem. Here's what I need. Here is a systemic barrier I'm facing. Here's just some really crappy behavior that I was subject to. I think you can help, and here's how. And I think a lot of people, especially right now, are willing to help, but we have to be willing to tell them we need help.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Spot on. And a lot of it is like moving from awareness to then action. I know here at WiseWise, we actually just launched a campaign called Know Your Data, which is encouraging organizations, VCs, startup ecosystem to begin to collect that diversity data of their employees or in their investments. And then once you understand the data that you have, you're able to then measure and track and understand the progress that you need to make and which areas to focus on. So I do hope that those are tuned in. If you don't know about the Know Your Data campaign, do check it out. It does come with some amazing commitments around awareness, advocacy, and action, as well as a diversity data help center, which provides EDI surveys, information on the Equality Act, and so much more to help you begin that journey and become a real ally. We have a few minutes left, and I know we're going to jump into Q&A, but Sarah, it's been absolutely awesome having you. And before we jump into the Q&A, I would just love to know, like, I guess with everything you're doing in Cleo Capital, what's the change that you would love to see in the startup and VC ecosystem?
I think for me, I would love to just see more diverse investors be given the ability to write more checks. And the reason for that, is that there isn't really a great, you can have as many startup founders as you want, but if there's no one to invest in them, it's really, really hard to be a founder, right? And so we tell people, go start a company. It's like, okay, great. Who's going to fund me? Like, I don't know, right? And that gets really hard really quickly. So, to me, not to me, data shows that the best way to drive diversity in venture is in the startup ecosystem is to have more diverse investors. And there's a bunch of different, if VCs have a daughter, the odds that they invest in more female founders like skyrockets, right? So there's all of these kind of correlation type things that we see, and we know that they make an impact. And so, putting more diverse investors in, particularly, more diverse female investors, I think is probably from a raw numbers standpoint, the fastest way to kind of drive change.
Fantastic. More money in the hands of diverse people, 100%. That's what I like to hear. So I believe we're going to jump into Q&A. And there's a few questions have come through, so I'm just going to go straight into them. Let's go. Let's see what good questions come through. Awesome. So I'm going to read this out. We saw a chat today from Rob Chestnut, former Chief Ethics Officer at Airbnb. Do you think every startup should hire a Chief Ethics Officer, or should the role we be looking to hire in the startup culture? So I guess this is around, do we need a Chief Ethics Officer?
Yeah, I think, look, Airbnb is about 3 seconds away from going public, right? So the idea that they're a startup the same way that like you and like, 3 of your friends who are just starting a company as a startup is like a little bit, off, right? That's like saying, the queen has several palaces. Should I too have several palaces? The answer is I would like several palaces, right? But I don't know if I have quite the same budget or need. And so I think it's the same thing. And Airbnb is also a fascinating company because it's a marketplace, right? It's a platform, and Airbnb can have the best intentions and ethics in the world, but they have, and they've had well-documented problems with this of their of people on their platform who, have shown racist behavior or other biased behavior or just creepy behavior. And so, they do need to think about the implications of ethics probably a lot more, right? Because the reality is that they are enabling a platform, but can only control day-to-day so much of what the actual activity, right? So I think that if you are a massive multi-billion-dollar marketplace, you probably need a chief ethics officer. If you are a 7-person startup, I think that you should hire ethical people, and you should have it as like a discrete sort of question and framework, right? The same way it's pretty common to say, hey, we're gonna release this new app build. What do you think it's gonna do to revenue, right? What do you think it's gonna do to user growth, right? We're making we're changing the homepage so that there's no logged out experience. You have to make an account to be able to see any content, right? Twitter does this. Well, when Twitter makes that decision, and you can't just go on and see tweets from twitter.com, you have to actually log in. Then they're probably seeing a bunch of different, data points move all over the place, and they make that decision of whether or not they want to do it, right? Companies should, not just Twitter, but companies should also be having the same questions around, what does this do to our ethics, right? We see this a lot in online communities where there's anonymity and people are terrible to each other, right? And so if you say, but at the same time, there are also people who say, well, if you force people to use their identities, it's maybe not safe for some marginalized groups. What do we do? Right. And the answer is there are answers to most of these things, right? But they're not going to be sort of the 5 people around your table who have answers. It's going to be, going and seeking out, research or best practices from, often academia or somebody who is, paid to be a thinker on these issues, right? And not just saying, well, this is what everybody else is doing, it's fine. So I think that you need to have, it's sort of like cooking, right? If you have a personal chef, great. But if you don't have a personal chef and you don't know how to cook and you don't want to order out every night, like, you're probably going to starve to death. I don't think you can outsource all of it. I think you have to have the basic ability to boil water, let's say.
Mm-hmm. So it should really be within the thread of your company. And then that community safety is so important around ethics, building the right culture. I guess also it's also the same for, I guess, female founders. And there's a question here around what advice would you give female founders who are struggling to find a foothold in the startup community dominated by male founders?
I think it's again sort of like the, what is it different? Like when you're pitching, you just sort of do it, right? I mean, most of my startup life, I've worked for male founders, sometimes a mix of I've never worked at a company where it's only female founders, right? So, it's like, I think you just decide, there are tons of great male founders, there are tons of terrible female founders, and vice versa, right? And terrible meaning both they're good at their job as well as they're good people, or not. And so I think it's just going out and finding your community. And again, if you only surround yourself with female founders and you don't ever talk to any male founders, that's just as silly as a white dude founder who only talks to white dude founders. Like, why wouldn't you want to take advantage of the entire breadth of your community, right? Of your peers who are going to have different ideas, different inputs, different relationships that you can build into your network. So to me, I think that the idea, anytime as a founder that you want to sort of wall yourself off into a tiny box of, I only want to talk to other, founders who've raised from this investor, who went to this school, or who are this gender, or who are this race, like, I would say, why, right? And I don't think that's where you see success. I think success, we know that diversity drives returns. And so you want a diverse group of people at every part of your life, including your peer group. And the great news is that there are lots of awesome female founders, and they're very readily available. So you can build some of those relationships, but I don't think that the way you build relationships with female founders is by saying, oh, how do I avoid all the men in my industry?
Mm-hmm. And if you are looking for a community, wise, we have an awesome community of loads of individuals. So you can join our community by heading over to our website and get involved in some of our founder and talent activities. Or you can also join our advocates community of allies and individuals that want to show up and make spaces for people that look like myself, or individuals that are on this call. So that's super important as well. So there's a founder question here, which is really interesting as well. What 3 pieces of advice would you give to startups in making sure they're getting things right from the get-go?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important. There's this idea kind of technical debt, right? Which is the idea that you build something, and the tech isn't great, and you think, oh, I'll fix it tomorrow, and then eventually, you have this massive accumulation of technical debt. Technical debt is one form of debt, but in startups we tend to accrue debt everywhere. And so I think the biggest thing you can think of on a day-to-day basis is, where am I accruing debt, and do I really want to accrue that debt, right? And so that might be in, hiring or marketing, or, investor updates are a great example, right? So many founders haven't had the time to write their investor update, right? And they think, I'll do it tomorrow, I'll do it next month, I'll do it next quarter. And then all of a sudden there's a problem, and you're reaching out to a bunch of angel investors who are like, dude, I haven't heard from you in 6 months. I haven't heard from you in a year. And now you're telling me, hey, could you wire me more money tomorrow, because otherwise I can't make payroll? And it's like, new phone, who dis, right? Like, I don't know you. And so I think that one of the best things you can do as a founder is be incredibly transparent and incredibly consistent, right? So ask yourself on a consistent basis, like, is it, am I being transparent? Am I being consistent? And in general, the things we don't want to be transparent about are probably where there's a lot of room for improvement. And that changes from person to person, right? So it's easy to say, pick one metric that matters. And for some founders who are more kind of shiny object oriented and distractible, that's really good advice. If you are like a super heads down person, your entire team will be quitting, and you'll have all these disasters, and you're like, well, the metric is working, right? And that's not good either. And so I don't think that it's as simple as, listen to some woman on a webinar say 3 things and do them. I think it's, being incredibly thoughtful about knowing your metric, right? What is the one metric that matters? Is it users? Is it revenue? Is it growth? Is it whatever? But then also being really thoughtful about all the other parts of your company, and be willing to like understand your weaknesses as well, right? So I know what I'm relatively good at, and I know what I'm relatively bad at. And so I, one, hire people to help complement where I'm not as good. But two, I'm also willing to be a little bit uncomfortable, right? So if I don't know a ton about a given space, I'm not just looking to hire somebody who's going to tell me, "Oh no, your instincts are really good on this. You're right." I want somebody who's going to actually make sure that I'm doing the right things. And so those are the kinds of things that I think are easy to overlook, and we just sort of settle into the groove of, and this also kind of drives back into lack of diversity. If you just settle into the groove of, I want to hire people who tell me what I want to hear and who I'm comfortable around, your company will suffer, right? Startups are too hard to not set yourself up for success. And the best way to set yourself up for success is to surround yourself with people who are incredibly honest and incredibly hardworking, and who will tell you the truth, who will be transparent with you, even if they're not the person who, sort of flattered you the most in the interview.
So powerful. We actually had a team away day here at Wise. I say away, but it was all virtually. Mm-hmm. And we ended up doing our personality types, going through our strengths and weaknesses, and also creating user manuals, which we found super useful. Like everybody on our team has a user manual where we say, this is what we're great at, this is how we like to work, but also these are some of our weaknesses. And I had to admittedly say, like, my weaknesses were around processes, so which are so paramount. But what that meant is that the team then said, Deborah, here's some really good suggested processes that you can use, such as Monday.com, Trello, and more. So I think being honest and open with those weaknesses then invites people on your team to then give really great suggestions or identify areas where you can hire someone and support. So that honesty is so important.
Exactly. And, the flip side of that, of course, right, is you don't get to say, oh, I'm bad at X, I'm bad at being on time, so I'm going to be 2 hours late for everything. And I told you, right, like that's also not how you're going to, that doesn't work either. But I think being, thoughtful and transparent and honest, and not, and coachable is another big thing with founders, right? Probably one of the more common reasons why I'll pass on a deal is that a really early deal is the founder will be really smart and they are really, interesting company, but you try to give them even the smallest amount of feedback and they're like, no, we know this, and we know this, and we know this. And and you're like, okay, sounds like you know it all and you don't need me, so bye. And, the reality is, maybe if you're like a lawyer or a doctor or something, and you do the same exact thing every day, right? You don't really necessarily need to be coachable after a certain point. I don't know. But as a startup founder, the company you're running 6 months ago is going to look nothing like the company you're running today or 6 months from now. And the more successful your company is, the more true that is. So if you can't take feedback and coaching, it's going to be too hard. It's just going to be too hard. And startups are already so hard that if you sort of make that piece of it more difficult for yourself, then I have a hard time believing you'll succeed. And I don't have enough capital to invest in startups that won't succeed.
It's been said. Hard Things. I don't know if anyone's read the Hard Things About Hard Things. I absolutely love that book, but that has a lot of lessons in there, especially around this particular conversation. Another question just come through, which is super interesting. How can we ensure that we are constantly battling bias in tech and algorithms?
Yeah. So I mean, tech and algorithms is just like a fancy way to say people, right? It's literally just a fancy way to say, how do we, ensure that we're constantly battling bias in people? And keep in mind that you have bias too, right? We all have bias. It's just what we do as humans. And to some extent, it is, it's sort of a primitive instinct that's relatively helpful, because if a tiger starts charging at you, you don't want to sit there, right? Like babies don't actually have any bias. So they have no bias against sticking their hand into a pot of boiling water or crawling into the street, right? Those are bad lacks of bias because, that's Darwinism. You don't stick around very long. So be aware that you have bias, right? Because everybody does. And in some instincts it's helpful, but then instances it's helpful. But unless you are confronted with something that's literally life or death, or at very least incredibly dangerous, your bias is probably not helping you. It's probably hurting you, right? Because cavemen weren't startup founders. I shouldn't say that. I don't know any cavemen, but I don't believe that cavemen and women, cave people, right, were starting companies and raising money. So their biases were more about survival day to day, right? Whereas ours are just kind of getting us into a terrible situation when it comes to our hiring and what we're building. And so I think acknowledging you have a bias is a really great, and also a bias towards, right? A bias towards something is just as damaging as a bias against, right? I think in general, the easiest way to think about this is if everybody on your team looks like you're not doing a good job building your team. And that doesn't matter if looks like you means looks like me or you, Deborah, or it looks like a white dude, right? Like that is the odds that the only and best people to build your team, and I'm not talking about like your co-founder, I'm talking like 5 people, 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, all look like you. Statistically, that's not possible, right? So that means statistically, you have adverse selected people into roles when there are better people that you didn't hire, right? And so, and it's the same with building products, right? If you are, the easiest way to fix sort of bias in tech is thinking about, who's around the table when you're building it and testing it and kind of ideating it. So a really great example in the auto industry is in like the 50s, they wanted to build a car for women, right? Like that's just a car, but they wanted to build a car for women. And they didn't have any female employees as car designers, right? So they made all the men come in dressed as women, and they were wearing heels and their gloves and their purses and their hats. Immediately all the guys were like, oh my God, like we need a place to put our purse. Like, and so now in most cars, when you open the glove compartment, right, the sort of console in the middle, and there's like that thing that was put there so you could put your purse somewhere, right? Back when purses were little. And men never thought of that, right? And then they tried it and they were like, oh my God, right? Or an example I love to talk about is I got a sunburn once, literally once. And I'd grown up seeing friends get sunburns and like their skin turns red. They're like, oh, that's so funny. You press it and it turns back white, whatever. So I'm in Miami and we're like hanging out. All of a sudden I get really sick, like really sick. Like I thought I'd been poisoned. I like wanted to go to the hospital. And all of a sudden, like everyone's freaking out. I'm like laying in the bathroom. It is disastrous. One of my friends looks at me and she goes, you have a sunburn. I was like, no, I don't have a sunburn. I'm dying. I got poisoned. And she's like, you have a sunburn. That's why your skin feels like it's burning, but cold and clammy. Like you're sick because you have a little bit of sun poisoning. You have a sunburn. And I explained to her that there's no way a sunburn could feel like this because it's my best friend from like growing up. I was like, I've watched you get multiple sunburns a year your entire life. If they felt like this, you wouldn't do it. She's like, no, they do feel like this. This is why I don't want to get them. Right? And so imagine if you're a person in the audience who gets sunburns being like, this girl, Sarah, you're an idiot. It's a sunburn. How would you know that? I'd never had that happen to me before, right? And so when you think about that and you scale back to, this was before I was an investor, but I actually worked in beauty. So if they had come to me, a week before that and said, we really think we need to get more into sunscreen as a category, I would have been like, it's sunscreen, like whatever, it's easy to get, who cares? Like nobody cares, sunburns aren't a big deal. Oh my God, no, they're a huge deal. They're terrible, right? So it's just such an easy example of like, if you have a lack of diversity, the ability to spot those obvious things, I guarantee there's someone screaming at their screen right now, some like very, very pale person being like, of course sunburns hurt, right? But like, I didn't know that. Like Deborah, you and I should probably not be making sunscreen, right? And so having diversity around the table means you can make better products because you have more empathy for the user.
100%. I think being in close proximity to a situation that you might not necessarily experience every day makes you have a lot more empathy to that. And so I think I've never had a sunburn, but I do use it has 15% SPF in it. That's how I keep myself looking 19.
Exactly.
But I think we've got a few minutes left, and so awesome to speak to, and such admiration for the work that you do. And I think with our last question, we'll probably ask, what's been the single biggest win in your career?
I don't think that is, I think, a dangerous way to think about the world, right? So if you kind of think like one thing is your single biggest win or whatever, then you're going to be in this world where you say, if this is the single biggest win, if this contract, if this investment, if this investor, then if it doesn't happen, then like what happens, right? Or if it happens and then it goes poorly, what happens? And so, it is not, think of Serena Williams, right? I do a lot of investing with her fund, and what is Serena Williams' biggest win, right? You might say, oh, that time at Wimbledon, yeah, but how did she get there, right? It was that win before the win before the win before, and to some extent, right, the biggest win in Serena Williams' career was probably some game when she was like 10 and was so sick of tennis and didn't feel like she was good that if she had lost, she might have like refused to keep playing. Right. And so the idea that it's easy to say your biggest win is the flashiest thing you've done. And in general, your biggest wins are the things that you do that like get you to where you are. And I also think, at a time, one of my friend's dads always says when something absolutely terrible happens, he's like, you're probably getting some luck right now. And you're like, no, like I just got laid off, like I just got divorced, something terrible happened. Right. But his point is you don't actually know when you're getting lucky in the moment. Right. So the things that you think are the absolute worst thing to happen to you. Right. To go back to Chrysalis, all of those people, when they got laid off in April and May, were like, oh my God, my life's over. Right. And then now, they're startup founders and they've started a company and they've learned a whole new skill set and they have a whole new confidence and they're raising money and, maybe they'll go on to become billionaires, but that, or maybe the companies will fail, but they're doing something new that none of them were really thinking to do. Right. So if you told them the day they got laid off, they're get the call on Zoom or whatever. And if you had, messaged them and said, oh, this is the biggest win you're going to have, you're so lucky, they would have probably punched you in the face, right? Socially distanced punched you in the face. So, it's one of those things where I would really, especially as a startup founder, shy away from the idea of this is a win, this isn't a win, right? And we see this all the time anecdotally, right? Like Steve Jobs got fired from Apple. Right? That is not a win. He was a founder of the company. He got fired, but then that was part of the reason that he was able to go away, work on other stuff. Apple understood that they actually did need him. And then he came back and the rest was history. Right. And so, is that firing, without that firing, if he'd stayed, would he have ever had as much control at Apple to build some of the stuff he built? Who knows? Right. But at the same time, you could also flip that and say, well, if he hadn't been at Apple, if he hadn't been so rich, maybe he would have like listened to more doctors and he would have had a better outcome for his cancer. Like you literally can't, we call it in America Monday morning quarterback. Like you can't sit around and try to figure out in retrospect what the biggest or best decision was. You have to make the best decision you can in the time you have with the facts at hand and like just keep going. And so, I think scorekeeping in general is something better left to referees than startup founders. And so, I don't have a biggest win. Either, I guess all of them are, right? Every day you wake up is a biggest win because it would be very hard to do this talk if I were dead.
I agree. And I think there's something that Steve Jobs says where you can't connect the dots. Sometimes you can't connect the dots looking forwards. You can always connect the dots looking backwards. Yeah. And so you go throughout your life, looking back, it's like actually that decision, every decision led me to this other moment, this other moment, this other moment. And I'm here. But also, I love this statement that Lauryn Hill makes is that she never feels like she's arrived anywhere. And I think often it's like, oh yeah, I'm like featured in TechCrunch. I got featured in Wire. I just made it. You haven't arrived. There's still more work to be done. And I think especially for marginalized communities, not to put the pressure of like, we need to work 10 times harder, but there's so much possibilities, and like literally the world is our oyster, and it's like we've got to keep going and keep grabbing those opportunities and thriving in those spaces.
And I think it depends on individual people, right? But like if you are, I think most people shouldn't start startups. I think startups are really hard. I think running a fund is really hard, whatever. But if this is something you want to do, then you're never done, right? Like go look at Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk, and like I'm not saying look at them to like revere them. Like I don't have an opinion on them for the most part, but I'm saying that like they are all obscenely wealthy, obscenely successful, and like they're at work right now. You know what I mean? And so if you're going to start a company, if you're going to run a company, there isn't a, oh, I raised $1 million, I made it, right? There's not even an, oh, I have $1 billion, I've made it. There's not even, oh, I have, close to $1 trillion and I've made it. You just keep going until you decide not to, which is also okay, right? But when you're doing a startup or when you're running a company, there's always something else to do. There's always a new problem. And I think to some extent, you just like embrace it, right? Instead of trying to fight it, you say, yeah, this is it, right? It's like working out. If you are working out and you think, oh my God, like, I can't believe how hard this is. When is it going to be over? It's going to be miserable. When you do it and you say, like, this just is, right? Like, it is 6 a.m., it is freezing cold, and I am out on a run, and this is painful, and like, that's what I'm doing. Like, I'm not trying to, like, it's not going to feel the same as laying on a beach sipping a pina colada, and that's good, right? Because I'm choosing to do this. And so I think when you sort of choose your choice, the fact that there isn't a done, the fact that there isn't a finish line, the fact that you do just keep going, like, the goal isn't, if the goal is to just hit some finish line and then be done, like, go buy lotto tickets, right? Go buy lotto tickets, win your $1 million and like retire, right? But if the goal is to do the thing, it's not the achieving the thing, because there is no achievement. There's just always more problems and more opportunities. It's the process. And so if you don't love the process of building things, if you don't love the process of running a company, then there's not going to be an outcome that feels good enough for you. You have to love the process. And if you love the process, then doing the process is exciting because you want to be doing what you love.
Mm-hmm. That's it. I think Diddy and May said it well, more problems, more money, more problems. And sometimes you can break those problems. Sarah, it's been an absolute pleasure. How can we follow your journey? Keep up to date?
So, cleocap.com, the website, and is my website. I'm on Instagram and Twitter, at Sarah Kunst. And yeah, I find me online. Anybody can pitch me on cleocap.com. And I look forward to hearing from you.
Awesome. Thank
God.
you.
Guys, that was amazing. I love that line. If you want to start a startup, then you're never done. I was like, yes, you're so right. But also that moment when you said, if everyone in your team looks like you, then you can't be doing a good job building your team. That for me was the message of the day. I know that I don't feel like I'm doing a good job in that yet. And I think that you've closed out the day in such a special way. So thank you. And thank you to all of you listening. I hope you have learned something new, you've met someone new, and you have made a promise to change. I will see you all next week. And Deborah, Sarah, thank you. And hope to see you at some time in the web sphere.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Bye.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.